Welcome back. We've been talking about why intermediate goods might lead to double counting, and we talked about gas being a great example here. So when gas is drilled out of the ground, we add, say, $3 of value, and the price reflects that value added. But when the gas is when oil is refined into gasoline, and the price is, say, $3.30 a gallon, what's the value added there? Well, if refining added 30 cents to the price, then there's probably 30 cents of value added. And I'll put it in dollar terms just to be clear. And again, as that refined gasoline gets shipped to various people, again, the price goes up by 30 cents, suggesting that 30 cents of value was added. Moving on, it looks like to 40 cents of value is added for the retail market. So all in all, we've added $4 of value to that retail gasoline, and the total value added reflects that final sales price in the retail market. But if we included all the intermediate goods, the GDP in this example of 1 gallon of gas, which is only $4, would be $13.90. So we can see by including intermediate goods, we're subject to double counting. And instead, we want to just look at final goods to get how much value is added to the economy. GDP is the market value of all final goods and services produced within a nation. To put it differently, who is producing doesn't matter. That's irrelevant. What matters is the borders. We only count goods and services that are produced within the physical borders of a nation. And this comes into play because we calculate GDP through a method known as the expenditure method. So we'll see that in a couple slides. But to put a fine point on it, it does not matter who is producing, just where it's produced. So if a service is provided in France by a US citizen, if I fly over to France and consult the Sorbonne on a research project, that's included in French GDP. Similarly, if a product is produced in the US by a company that's owned by Germans, it's included in US GDP. And this is important when we think about large multinational companies and the influence they have on the economy. So what happens if Apple, a US company, produces an iPhone in China? Not only does it not add anything to US GDP, but since we're then going to import that iPhone into the US, it might actually subtract from US GDP. And we'll see this a little bit more in a second. GDP is the market value of all final goods and services produced within a nation over a particular period of time. And usually that production is within a year, which means not only does it matter where it was produced, but it matters when it's produced. This also means it doesn't matter if it's sold, it matters when it's produced. And again, there's a very important reason for this, and this reason is to prevent double counting. So I drive a car that I bought used, and that car counts towards 2011's GDP. 2011's GDP, not this year's GDP. We don't include the sale of used goods in GDP because, as we'll see when we learn the expenditure method, they count as an investment in that company's inventory if they're produced but not sold. Similarly, what doesn't go in GDP? The sale of stocks or bonds or other financial transactions, because nothing is produced there. That's just a transfer payment. It's just moving money from one account to the other. So, GDP is the market value of all final goods and services produced within a nation over a particular period of time, usually a year. And that's a really powerful definition. We know what's in it, we also know what's not in it. But to actually get this number requires a lot of robust and fancy statistical work that are certainly beyond the scope of this class. What we're going to do is look at a much more simple method of calculating it. And we want to know exactly how much is spent on a nation's production. And that's done by the BEA. I'll drop a link into that slide, but the BEA is the Bureau of Economic Analysis. And the way they calculate GDP is what's known as the expenditure method, or national income accounting. And what they do is they just add up a couple of these key components, these only components of GDP: consumption, investment, government purchases, and net exports. And what net exports are exports, so the stuff we send out, minus imports, or the stuff we bring in. So that was just a list. What we're going to do now is take a second and define each of these terms in GDP, each of these terms we calculate in the expenditure method, starting with consumption. And that's perhaps because consumption is the easiest for all of us to understand. Consumption is just the final purchase of goods and services by you all, the consumers, or by households. So everything you buy, with the exception of new housing, goes into this list. So your clothes, your car, your food, if you buy a refrigerator, if you buy an iPad, everything you spend money on goes into consumption. Investment is spending not by you all, the consumer, but by businesses. Investment is spending by businesses. So where you're buying clothes and food and iPads, businesses are building factories and buying capital. Similarly, these new housing purchases that you are making, I said that wasn't in consumption, that goes into investment, and really it's just so the math works out. But when I say investment, I don't mean financial investment, which we think of as savings. Investment does not include spending on stocks or bonds. Investment is spending by businesses. And when you hear in the news or read in the paper or see that the Fed is lowering interest rates to spur investment, it doesn't mean for you all to invest in the market, which is just saving. It means they want businesses to build new factories to invest in capital goods. So earlier we said that things that are produced and not sold are still counted in GDP. And that's because when something is produced but not sold, it's essentially a business purchasing that thing and adding it to its inventory. Next, we have government purchases. What does a government purchase? Well, the same things you purchase and the same things a business purchases. Government writes paychecks, a government buys food, a government makes roads or bridges or prisons or tanks. And when I say the government, I don't just mean the federal government, but state and local governments as well. So spending at all levels of government on newly produced, again, final goods and services. But again, what makes GDP so powerful is not just what goes into it, but what does not go into it. And government spending does not include transfer payments, because in a transfer payment, all that happens is money moves around. Nothing is produced, and GDP is a measure of production. So one thing the government does quite often is write checks, for instance, a Social Security check. But Social Security is just a transfer payment. It is not included in US GDP. And finally, we have net exports, or exports minus imports. Exports are the goods that we produce here and sell in other countries. Imports are the goods produced elsewhere that are sold here. Typically, the US runs a trade deficit, meaning we're importing more than we're exporting. This is not necessarily problematic because we are paying for these things with our money, and arguably we're made better off by the fact that we can bring in things produced at a lower cost. However, that's not to say GDP is not without its shortcomings. So let's do a pause and think. We'll end this mini video, and in the next one, we'll come back to think what some of the shortcomings of GDP might be.